Okay, thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. It's right at afternoon, I guess. There are people still trickling in, but in the interest of time, I want to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Iowa Environmental Council's presentation on the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, otherwise known as MRRRI. My name is Ingrid Gronstal. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Water Program Director here at IEC. I'm currently based out of Iowa City, Iowa, which is the ancestral territory of the Kickapoo, Iowa, and Sauk and Meskwaki people. I'll be starting off the presentation today. Thank you all for coming. As most of you know, Iowa Environmental Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan law and policy advocacy organization. We advocate for clean water and clean energy across the state. We're the largest environmental coalition in the state. We have close to 90 member organizations, including nonprofits, businesses, utilities, student organizations, so a broad and diverse array of organizations and people across the state who are interested in environmental protection and the health of our communities and our environment. One of our key strengths and interests here at IEC is relationship building and networking. So with an eye toward that, we would invite people to please make use of this virtual space. Now that we're at this point in the pandemic, I think everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom and how Zoom webinars function, but please go ahead and use the chat functions to get to know each other. If you'd like, please introduce yourself with your name, organization, and location in the chat as we get started here. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We'll take questions from the audience at the end of the discussion, but you can put your question in at any time. This presentation will be 1 hour and end at 1 p.m. and we do need to end promptly at 1 p.m. But we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So please definitely let us know if you have questions or thoughts during the presentation. I am joined today by 3 other wonderful speakers. And with that, I will let them briefly introduce each other. Alicia, please go first.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Vasto. I'm the Water Policy and Advocacy Specialist here at the Iowa Environmental Council.
And Maisa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maisa Khan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Water Policy Director for the Mississippi River Network. I am based out of St. Louis, Missouri, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Illini and many other Native communities. And I'll just speak briefly about the Mississippi River Network. We are a coalition of nearly 60 organizations all up and down the river, from the headwaters in Minnesota down to the Gulf. Both of my fellow presenting organizations are members of the Mississippi River Network, so both IEC and Friends of the Mississippi are members. We implement the only national public program of its kind called the One Mississippi program. I hope many of you will have heard of One Mississippi. I'll type into the chat a way for you all to get involved in the One Mississippi program by being a river citizen. So I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Great, thanks, Maisa. And Trevor.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor Russell. I'm the Water Program Director with Friends of the Mississippi River. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and restoring the Mississippi River and its watershed in Minnesota. We are part of both MRN as well as the MRRRI campaign team and MRRRI Steering Council, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are and what that means later in this presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So we'll start with just a general, what what questions are we planning to answer for you today? First, why is this the moment for a new initiative and a new vision for the Mississippi River? What is MRRI? How does MRRI work, particularly on justice and equity and environmental justice issues? That's something that I'm really proud that this campaign and this collaborative has really focused on. Who is involved so far? Who are the groups involved? Where can I get more information on this, and how do folks get involved? So hopefully we will answer all of these questions over the next hour. So first, why is it time for a new vision, and why do we care about the Mississippi River? I think first and foremost, the Mississippi is a national and global treasure. This is an extremely culturally important river for the entire country. As you can see from this map, the Mississippi River watershed encompasses a vast portion of the middle of the country. And this river is remarkable, and it's essential to the nation's culture and our economic and our environmental health. The river has been a vital transportation corridor and cultural inspiration. I know, I just think about having lived in the Midwest for the majority of my life, all of the various ways in which I have interacted with the river, from all the way from Minneapolis to New Orleans, La Crosse, Wisconsin, the Quad Cities, Dubuque. There's just so many, there's books, Mark Twain was from Hannibal, Missouri. The Mississippi Delta is the cradle of the blues and muddy waters. New Orleans is obviously a vibrant cultural hub and cultural city, and a lot of that stems from their proximity to the Mississippi River and all of the ways in which the Mississippi interacts with our life and our history. The Mississippi is also important to our economy. The Mississippi generates nearly $500 billion in annual revenue, and directly supports the employment of more than 1.5 million people. The river also provides drinking water for more than 20 million people in 50 cities. And if you know your drinking water comes from the Mississippi, go ahead and let us know in the chat. We'd definitely be interested to see, who all knows if their drinking water is coming from the Mississippi. And with that, I will turn it over to Alicia to talk about the ecology and habitat of the river.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. So our remarkable river and its 30 million acre floodplain are the ecological lifeline flowing through the heart of our nation. It's the migration corridor or flyway for 60% of all North American birds. In fact, it supports more than 780 species of wildlife, from our nation's symbol, the bald eagle, to the rare and elusive paddlefish. And yet, the Mississippi River is at risk. So despite all the important values and gifts the river provides us, it is still at risk. Runoff has drastically reduced water quality and harmed aquatic life throughout the river system. In this photo, you can see the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota. The Minnesota River is on the left, and you'll notice it's carrying all this sediment into the Mississippi River on the right. Changes to the river and its floodplain have left communities more vulnerable to floods, hurricanes, and other storms, leading to increased costs to keep our communities safe. And the river is also threatened by invasive species, such as the invasive silver carp. So this threatens our fisheries and recreational industries that rely on the river. And further downstream in the Gulf Delta, with its marshes, swamps, and barrier islands, It continues to lose ground while the annual Gulf dead zone or hypoxic zone continues to have terrible consequences for our environment and the economy. And a large portion of that dead zone is contributed to by Iowa and our nutrient pollution. However, there are models we can look to that have successfully started to reverse some of these trends in other natural places of significance. The Everglades, our Great Lakes, and Chesapeake Bay all have dedicated federal funding programs. These special geographically based funding programs allow us to better coordinate existing federal and state efforts. And by increasing funding and participation at all levels with states, tribes, local governments, and non-governmental organizations, we can better work together to address these challenges. That's why we think it's time for the Mississippi River to have a program of its own, the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, or MRRRI. So I'll turn it over to Trevor to talk about the what.
Thank you, Alicia. So what is the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, or MRRRI? As Alicia mentioned, the MRRRI concept is modeled around the success of existing initiatives like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It is a vision put forward and championed by Congresswoman Betty McCollum here in Minnesota's 4th Congressional District. MRRRI is a federal funding program. Our goal is to secure between $300 and $350 million per year in federal funding that would be invested back into our 10 main stem Mississippi River states through grants and other partnerships. As is the case with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, MRRRI is not regulatory. MRRRI would not create any new federal, state, or local policies or regulations, and it would not be used to enforce any existing rules or regulations. It's also a purely voluntary program. We envision entities like state, local, and regional governments, tribal governments and organizations, nonprofit organizations like many of us on this call, and other entities to apply for MRRRI funds in all 10 states. MRRRI funding is for eligible programs and projects in the watershed of the Mississippi River and its direct tributaries within that 10 state and tribal nation border along the Mississippi River itself. MRRRI will have 4 focus areas. The Environmental Protection Agency will be the lead federal agency coordinating MRRRI, but will work closely with other federal agencies as well as state and local partners. MRRRI would create, or its first step would be to create the first ever Mississippi River National Program Office housed within the US EPA. MRRRI funds would support actions or projects that restore clean water, protect and restore river habitat, rebuild natural infrastructure, and improve delta health, and reduce the impact of aquatic invasive species. So we wanted to take a moment to imagine that MRRRI legislation has passed and it's now law, and MRRRI funds are flowing to this work. What kinds of activities could we expect to be funded across these 4 areas? I'll briefly go over the kinds of investments and projects we might expect to see funded under MRRRI. Next slide. To improve water quality in the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, MRRRI would fund actions that reduce polluted runoff, excess nutrients, and sediment pollution to the river. And there are 2 main buckets of work under the clean water domain for MRRRI. The first is urban runoff, and this includes actions that prevent urban stormwater pollution or reduce combined sewer overflow events where raw sewage is discharged to surface waters through storm sewers. And the second bucket of clean water work relates to cropland runoff. So investments that conserve and protect lands that play a significant role in water pollution, promote soil health activities that help croplands retain water and filter out pollutants that would otherwise flow into the river, and actions that promote landscape scale vegetative cover. So here we're thinking about perennial grains, perennial woody crops, winter annual cover crops, perennial pasture, or other approaches that maintain year-round vegetative cover to protect our soils and enhance our water quality. It's worth noting there are some things that MRRRI wouldn't fund, which would include wastewater treatment plant upgrades, spills, or general superfund cleanup costs, as those are already pretty well funded at the federal level. But MRRRI funds could be used to clean up legacy contamination that wouldn't otherwise be funded through the Superfund program. Next slide. The second funding focus area is about restoring river life. MRRRI would protect and restore habitat along the river itself by funding work to protect and restore the river's ecological functions and processes. And this includes programs that restore riparian and floodplain wetlands, support in-stream habitat, including reconnecting side channels and backwaters with the main stem of the river, and support bluffland and upland habitat and living shorelines. Next slide. To help reduce flood and storm risks to communities along the Mississippi River and protect the Delta, the third area that MRRRI would fund is natural infrastructure projects. And these are investments that strategically restore the river's access to its floodplain. So this could include modifying or removing levees, dams, or culverts that impair natural river hydrology, protecting floodplain lands through acquisition or voluntary easements, and relocating, removing, or cleaning up flood-prone structures to restore floodplain access and minimize public cost. It will also help cover the cost of transporting responsibly sourced and dredged sediment to better aid with river floodplain and river delta restoration. And next slide. Finally, MRRRI will reduce the impact of aquatic invasive species by funding actions that control, manage, or eradicate non-native invasive aquatic species. This includes research, deterrence, and commercial harvesting of invasive carp species, as well as other aquatic invasive species like zebra mussels pictured here. MRRRI would also fund the reintroduction of native fish, mussels, and other aquatic species. Next slide. So now that you know a little bit about what some projects we imagine would work under MRRRI, let's talk about how we will decide which projects actually get funded. How will the funding areas be shaped and implemented in the long term? And the answer to that is it's up to all of us. We believe that river projects are more effective when all river voices have a seat at the planning table. And that's why the first step for MRRRI is for river stakeholders to come together to shape this initiative through a 2-year US EPA-led public process to develop what we're calling the MRRRI Action Plan. When it's time for us to identify priority projects and build this action plan, we'll all be sure to reach out to you, IEC members and supporters, to encourage your participation. Next slide. And one other thing I'd like to note is that we want this to be a science-based initiative. And so to ensure an evidence-based approach is applied in MRRRI, a MRRRI science plan will also be developed. The first step for this is to create a new National Mississippi River Corridor Research Center within the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS, which would also have 3 regional centers based out of host universities along the river. Once these research centers are up and running, federal, state, tribal partners, academic institutions, nonprofits, and other interested stakeholders could share current science, identify data gaps and areas of concern, and prioritize next steps in the MRRRI science plan. The science plan would then be incorporated into the MRRRI action plan, and both of those plans would be updated periodically as MRRRI moves through time. This is a brief overview of kind of how the nuts and bolts of what MRRRI is. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Maisa to talk more about how we're going to work to center justice and equity in this initiative. Over to you, Maisa.
Thank you, Trevor. So to recap, Trevor spoke about what MRRRI is, and I just want to spend some time speaking about how MRRRI will work on environmental justice and equity issues in our rivers corridor. And I'll also add here that the whole MRRRI initiative is really in the beginning stages, and this piece of it, especially on justice and equity, is a work in progress, as is many of the other pieces that we're talking about. So we're excited to be working with you all and hearing what you think about this, because we're just getting started. As many of you know, neither the benefits nor the burdens brought by the Mississippi River are equitably shared. And we know that far too often the voices of those most impacted by environmental decisions are often excluded or ignored in the making of those decisions. So I'm going to talk about our efforts to work on equity and justice in 2 tracks. One track is our internal work as a collaborative of organizations who are working to advance MRRRI. And the other track is what we might expect to see and want to see in the MRRRI legislation itself in the future. I'll also say that the work of centering justice and equity is a journey and not a destination. And we acknowledge that we will always have work to do as individual people and as organizations in this regard. And we're grateful, like I said, to hear from all of you now or at any point in MRRI's lifetime about how we can do better in our work on equity and justice. So the first piece, I'm going to talk about this our work internally as a MRRI collaborative. The MRRI collaborative is committed to building equity and inclusion into our overall approach. I'll speak, I'll speak more about who is part of this collaborative later on in this presentation, but the collaborative itself includes an equity committee. That equity committee provides guidance and support alongside the steering and campaign committees as part of this full collaborative. Currently, that equity committee includes the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, Lake Pepin Legacy Alliance, Freshwater, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Mississippi River Network, my organization. In the next slide, you'll see, so the committee embraces a key set of principles for engaging people in all 10 river states and tribal nations in pursuit of our MRRI goals. Some of the first steps that the equity committee has taken are building knowledge and understanding. We are conducting research and literature reviews of environmental justice issues up and down the Mississippi River. Second, establishing a micro fundraising effort within MRRI. So we're asking organizations that are able, who are already within our collaborative, to help fund staff time and capacity so that underrepresented organizations that would otherwise be unable to participate in our collaborative can do so. Third, widening the circle. We're planning to solicit honest and critical feedback from underrepresented groups, further refine our messaging and materials, and then work through existing relationships to begin to reach people that we haven't yet connected with. And lastly, lifting up all voices. As MRRI continues to be developed, we'll boost each other's efforts, elevate key issues and opportunities, and bring local efforts and organizations into this national platform. And then in the next slide, you'll see, so Trevor talked about the 4 focus areas of MRRI. And I just finished talking about the internal ways that we're working on equity and justice. Now, what will the MRRI legislation, the initiative itself, do to center equity and justice issues? Well, so we have these 4 focus areas of clean water, river corridor habitat, natural infrastructure, and aquatic invasive species. And we're committed to making sure that this funding is equitable and directed with intention to communities that have faced disproportionate harms from environmental degradation and environmental racism. We also know that the kinds of restoration projects, and many of those that Trevor already sketched out for us, those kinds of projects create jobs and reinvigorate local economies. They reinvigorate our river communities. So we think it's really important to invest this money where it will have the most impact, not just for our environment, but also for our river communities. Next, in the next slide, yep, thank you, Alicia. So that's why the MRRI legislation itself will contain a goal to direct some percentage of its overall funds annually to projects, outreach, and or research that directly benefits communities of color, low-income communities, and economically disadvantaged communities. Further, a subset of that overall percentage would be directed to persistent poverty communities within the 10-state river corridor. Currently, Congresswoman McCollum's legislation proposes that 25% of funds will be directed to communities of color, with 10% directed to communities in persistent poverty. Of course, as many of you might be familiar with legislative language and movements on the Hill, they evolve every day. So the exact percentage cited here might change, but what I want to really hammer down is that our intent to prioritize those investments in communities of color and low-income river communities is a mainstay of the MRRI vision. So that is how we are working on justice and equity issues in both the internal MRRRI collaborative and what we are hoping to see in the legislation itself. And with that, I'll move into our next question that we want to answer for you all today is who is involved in MRRRI so far? And I'll just say, like I said earlier, this is really the beginning stages, and part of why we're having conversations like these is to get more folks involved. So first, I'll talk about the collaborative. Currently, we have over 30 regional, state, local, and national organizations working together as part of the MRRRI collaborative. That group shares information, we strategize about how we want MRRRI to be implemented, and engage, as we're doing right now, with our respective communities and important stakeholders. Then we have the MRRRI Steering Committee. So the MRRRI Steering Committee provides overall strategic leadership and guidance. And that group includes all the organizations you see here, hopefully many organizations that you are familiar with. We have American Rivers. We also have Friends of the Mississippi River, Trevor's organization, and my organization, the Mississippi River Network, as well as national organizations like the National Wildlife Federation. So that's the full group of our steering committee. We're eager to add more voices to balance our geography, demographics, issue expertise, and organizational type and size. So we welcome any of your organizations who are interested in having a leadership role. And the MRRRI Collaborative is led by rotating co-chairs who are currently Matt Rhoda with Healthy Gulf in Louisiana and Whitney Clark of the Friends of the Mississippi River. Then our next layer of who's involved is the MRRRI campaign team. Our campaign team focuses on our legislative and outreach strategy to get MRRRI over the finish line in 2021. So that's a smaller group. The National Wildlife Federation leads on legislative strategy, FMR leads on communications, and my organization, the Mississippi River Network, leads on organizing and outreach. And as part of my role with the MRRRI campaigns team, I work closely with our state leads. So I fully appreciate and acknowledge the expertise and the leadership and the connections that our state-based organizations have to make sure that initiative like MRRRI is actually serving the needs of our states. So that's why we created this group of state leads. We have one organization in each state. And as the river flows, the MRRRI state leads are Friends of the Mississippi River, Clean Wisconsin, the Iowa Environmental Council, your organization, the Illinois Environmental Council, Conservation Federation of Missouri, Kentucky Waterways Alliance, Tennessee Wildlife Federation, Arkansas's Ducks Unlimited, the Mississippi Wildlife Federation, and Healthy Gulf in Louisiana. So I'll just plug here that you're in the right place to hear more updates about MRRRI that will be coming out of your state lead, the Iowa Environmental Council. So I just appreciate that you are already plugged in and interested. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ingrid to talk more about how you can stay involved going forward.
Of times, MRRRI is really MRRRI and the work surrounding MRRRI is really in the beginning stages. As all of these groups that Maisa just mentioned are working to achieve the vision of a geographic program for the Mississippi River. So a few ways that you can get involved, and Maisa also mentioned this at the top, becoming a river citizen with MRN, so that you can receive regular listserv updates on how MRRRI is progressing, current ways to support the efforts, and any other important information. I will also say, being a river citizen and being part of the One Mississippi initiative, they do a lot of great programming, a lot of great events, and all the way up and down the river. So that's a great resource and a great source of information for MRRRI and all sorts of work related to the Mississippi River. And then, staying connected with us at IEC as the state lead in Iowa. We'll continue to provide information about MRRRI and updates on how you can get involved, particularly when it comes to local and congressional level advocacy. And then also, if you have specific questions, if you want your organization to get involved, like Misa was saying, you can definitely reach out to me or Alicia individually, and we can talk through more specific areas of interest or specific questions that you might have. So as we wrap up the presentation section of this webinar, I just want to take a few minutes to share where we're at in our journey and what's coming up in the near term for MRRRI. So thanks in part to Congresswoman McCollum's leadership, legislation will begin moving through Congress that funds and authorizes the establishment of MRRRI this year. In fact, we just heard this week, Congresswoman McCollum and her team are hoping to drop the legislation within the coming weeks. So that's an exciting development. Of course, legislative timelines are constantly changing and evolving, so that may or may not come to pass, but we're really hopeful. It sounds like we're close to having this legislation introduced. So definitely stay tuned on that and continue to keep an eye on your inboxes for updates from IEC. And then after Congresswoman McCollum introduces legislation, the MRRRI Collaborative will be working with lawmakers in both chambers in Congress over the summer to move the bill forward. Even after MRRRI becomes law, we'll still have plenty of work to do every year to make sure that MRRRI is implemented in our various states, which is all to say, this is just the very beginning of a conversation that we hope to continue with you all in the next weeks, months, and years to come. But I think this is a really exciting opportunity, and I'm personally just really excited to be able to have a webinar presentation on a really positive opportunity, something that's really hopeful. So I appreciate everyone being here today and being interested and talking about some really exciting and positive steps forward. To better understand how existing federal programs impact the Mississippi River, late last year, Congress allocated $2 million to the EPA to inventory existing federal funding programs, identify gaps and opportunities, and make recommendations on how to improve river outcomes. And then, just as I said earlier, you can all expect more regular communications from IEC as MRRRI continues to unfold and evolve. All right, so just to go back, hopefully we answered these various questions, at least on a broader level. So those of you attending this afternoon have a better sense of why this is the right time to get a new initiative and a new vision for the Mississippi River and projects all along the main stem states. What is MRRRI? All of the various groups who are involved so far, where you can find more information and resources if you're interested in learning more and getting involved. Obviously, the focus on justice and equity, and then how to get involved further and stay plugged in with this effort. So now I think we can move into Q&A. All right, and let's see, the question is, what congressperson is interested in sponsoring this legislation? Trevor, can you talk about that a little bit?
I sure can. So the chief author in the House is Congresswoman Betty McCollum from here in Minnesota. She is currently reaching out to potential House co-authors from up and down the river. The goal here is to have both Republican and Democrat authors in both chambers. And so right now she's focused on identifying what the right Republican co-sponsor would be in the House. And then we've working in parallel to identify who the right co-authors or co-sponsors would be in the Senate. So I think those answers will probably become clear to all of us in the next 4 weeks or so.
And I'll add to that that the Mississippi River Network hosted a fly-in in March where we spoke. Alicia, Ingrid, and Trevor were part of that as well. And we spoke to nearly 30 congressional offices all up and down the river to just share this concept. And what we all heard back from many offices was positive, interested to learn more. So we are all hopeful that even after the Congresswoman's finding and securing the co-sponsorship, we're looking at a lot of folks up and down the river being supportive.
And as part of that fly-in, as our Iowa specific meetings, we did meet with Representative Hinson, Representative Miller Meeks, and Representative Axney, and talked with them about these, about MRRRI. Okay, there's a question in the chat. Have you given any thought to the rights of nature movement as a viable avenue? Maisa, you're shaking your head, so do you want to take that one?
Sure. Thank you for asking that question. And I'll just flag, I think a lot of people are named Jordan Bless in the participants list. So thank you to whoever asked that. And so we are in the process, as we said, of reaching out to lots of different stakeholders. And we have heard from, we are trying to meet with a group of, a native group in Minnesota who's very focused on the rights of nature movement, the rights of the river. So we're looking forward to connecting with them.
And another question, what was the response from Representative Hinson? We met with her staffer. It seemed like they were, still getting their feet under them. In March, they'd only been there a month or two. So they're definitely interested in the river, particularly, flooding and natural infrastructure, interested in the concept of MRRRI, but no specific promises or anything of that nature.
Ingrid, there's a question about the Mississippi River Parkway Commission. And I want to say that they are a member of the Mississippi River Network. So I will confirm that, but yes, all of our network members are very plugged in. And I'll just take a minute to look up my list and confirm that while we answer other questions.
Sure. And another question in the Q&A is, what about Representative Miller Meeks? She actually participated in the call herself along with her staff, which was nice to see. She is also definitely interested in, she talked about the importance of environmental protection, also the importance of economic development and economic vitality. So I think more the economic development pieces of MRRRI were of interest to her. I'm trying to think of our conversation about MRRRI specifically. She asked for follow-up materials, so we sent those on MRRRI. So again, they're kind of in the initial stages of introducing the concept of MRRRI, giving more information, and then once it's introduced, that gives once the legislation is introduced, that gives us an avenue to follow up and ask for some more specific support on that. All right. Are there other questions or thoughts anyone had? I know it's quite a bit of information. It's a new concept, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. Okay. How can an NGO become aligned with your org? And I'm not sure if this is your org as far as IEC or your org as far as MRN. I'll say from the IEC side, definitely contact me or Alicia or Jordan Bless, who appears several times today. But we can, we definitely have, as I mentioned at the top, close to 90 member orgs in the state. So we have a process for getting people involved, but I'm guessing this is more a question about MRN. So Maisa, do you want to just review that again?
Sure. Email me if we would love to talk to you. I just typed my email address. It's mkhan@1Mississippi.org. You can also reach out through our onemississippi.org info portal there, but feel free to reach out. We're a member-based organization, and we have a pretty easy process to join. So we'd love to have you and learn more about your organization.
Trevor, do you want to talk about FMR just for fun?
I always want to talk about FMR just for fun. If folks are interested in becoming a member of Friends of the Mississippi River, simply go to our website, fmr.org, and there's all kinds of information about becoming a member. I wonder, though, if this question might have been more towards joining the MRRRI Collaborative. And so with that in mind, I might include a link in the chat, and we just have sort of a Google Doc kind of one pager that is, if you're interested in becoming part of the collaborative. To be clear, the collaborative itself is not an organization. It's not a nonprofit. It doesn't exist as a thing. We are a collaboration of existing entities. And so if you want your organization to be a part of that collaborative, there's a little how to do so, and I'll put this link in the chat. And it's, whoop, I accidentally cut and pasted something else from our talking point script. Never mind, my thing isn't actually plugged in properly here. I will send it when I can get the correct link in the chat, and it provides a clear sense of, nope, still can't do it.
By thing isn't plugged in correctly, Trevor means, this thing.
Both my brain and my laptop and my keyboard are not talking to each other at the moment. So we'll send you the 101 about how to join the MRRRI Collaborative in a follow-up email.
And let me see if I can pull that up, Trevor, too.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Let's see, another question. You mentioned 10 universities. Would this mean one from each state, and have they already been identified?
I could take a crack at that. The correct link is now in the chat.
Oh, nice.
There you go. Sorry about that, everyone. It's one of those. As Alicia and Ingrid and Maisa will know, something technical always goes wrong on a MRRRI webinar. So if that's all that went wrong, we're in a pretty good place today. So we mentioned universities in a couple different lenses here. The first is that we are working with 3 universities to host regional sort of upper, middle, and lower Mississippi River research centers. And that is in partnership with the USGS Science Plan. They would still have the sort of overall science center based out of the USGS office. So that was the clearest reference to sort of colleges and universities. The second piece is that we're also working with some HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, to help refine our equity plan and inform the initial steps of our equity work within this overall project. So those are the 2 pieces where universities are most clearly engaged. I don't think we'd necessarily try to have a flagship college or university in each of the 10 main stem river states necessarily connected to this initiative. But one of the things we are doing is through our sort of grassroots outreach, connecting to some of those flagship universities. So, in Minnesota, we're mostly working with the University of Minnesota to help provide input on the action plan and to provide input on the science plan. And so I think our best strategy would be to ensure that we're engaging those organizations into those two processes, and then how they choose to continue their engagement in the broader MRRRI initiative or in the MRRRI collaborative will be up to them.
All right, great. Thanks, Trevor. Another question then in the chat, the state of the river and the Gulf Dead Zone, as well as many other environmental programs, are tied to big ag practices. How do you expect that might be addressed as part of this initiative?
I'd be happy to answer that one. So within our clean water domain, we talked about three sort of major buckets of work related specifically to agricultural practices. And so I'll touch on those again briefly. But to begin, this is not a regulatory program. This is not an enforcement program. We do not intend to apply any new rules or regulations or requirements on any participant or any state or local government or farm operation. This is purely a funding initiative. What we are hoping to do is provide funds that help accelerate an embrace of what we'll call continuous living cover cropping system approaches. Can we get green living vegetation year-round on the ground in our agricultural cropland areas? That is the single best thing we can do to help advance or accelerate our water quality goals. And it also, improves soil health, holds more water back on the land. Some of these practices have secondary benefits for, say, pollinators, habitat, migratory waterfowl. But in general, what we're looking at is three areas of investment. The first would be a modified land retirement. So we don't need this program to duplicate CSP or CRP practices at the federal level. And in Minnesota, we've got what's called CREP, which is basically taking CRP, and then in the 16th year, it becomes permanent on the state's dime. So it's a permanent land protection or retirement program. But once land is permanently protected or retired, there are also regulations about what sort of economic activity can be used on that land. What we want to try to do is explore through American Farmland Trust, and hopefully we can begin to work with many of the folks on this call, how can we modify or create new funding mechanisms that would allow for continuous living vegetation to exist on the land and still have that land be grazable or hayable or have some other economic activity associated with it, so that we're not depriving those landowners of some long-term economic return. So that's sort of one bucket. Think of it as land retirement, but it's land retirement with a twist. Could be traditional land retirement, or it could be a modified land retirement strategy. The second piece is working on investments in soil health. And so probably the single best thing from an agronomic perspective and an environmental perspective we can do over time is to begin to enhance soil health. So that could be things like no-till or cover crops. It could also look at integrated pest management and nutrients. It could even be transition to organic, things that overall enhance soil health. There are some programs that exist at the federal level, and then another patchwork of programs that exist at different state levels. Minnesota is just ramping up a new soil health initiative that we've been working on here, but providing funding to invest in those sorts of initiatives is the second piece. And then the third piece is, where are there market-based opportunities for producers to enhance and diversify their agricultural income streams by embracing continuous living cover practices? And so I'll just give two quick examples. In Minnesota, we've been working quite hard along with the Land Institute in Kansas to develop Kernza. So Kernza is a wheat, but it's a perennial. So it has all of the attributes environmentally of, say, a perennial prairie system, including about a 90% reduction in nitrate loss, but you harvest it and sell it as wheat. So it has the environmental and economic attributes. And second family of crops I'll talk about is camelina and pennycress. These are cover crops that can be sown into a standing field of corn. They will germinate. Corn is harvested over the top. That crop will now overwinter, come back up in the spring, and set seed and can be harvested as an oil seed, harvested and sold before soybeans come in the next year. So if you're a corn soy rotation, you've now had 3 harvests in 2 growing seasons. You've made more money than you would have. You've diversified your market into 3 different markets. So if prices are up or down in one or the other, you're still okay. And you've had continuous living vegetation on the landscape year round, meaning that when those big storms came in the spring, your soil didn't wash away. Any excess nutrients that were in the soil could be sort of cannibalized by that cover crop. reducing runoff to surface water or groundwater. So that's what we mean by sort of the market-based systems, is rather than just saying, here's a check, plant a cover crop, which works until you think about $50 an acre. We got 90 million acres of corn and soybeans in America. There's no way we're going to just be able to cash that out. But what if you can make it economically viable, attractive, self-sustainable over time? Can we begin to invest in those systems? And that's something that is missing in traditional farm bill conservation programs. And that's one of the areas we think that MRRRI investment could really help initiate a paradigm shift in how we approach agricultural cropland runoff.
Great, thanks, Trevor. That's a really good explanation. There's a follow-up that says, basically, it sounds to me like you're talking about regenerative agriculture practices. Have you been in touch with those orgs in the state? And I'm not sure what's going on with the Zoom, why so many participants are Jordan, which is too bad, because I would be interested to know who actually had this question. But I would say this is the point at which, you know, we are just trying to get additional organizations. Oh, thank you, perfect. We're trying to get additional organizations involved. And so definitely if you would like to be involved, or you have suggestions of organizations that you think should be plugged into this effort, definitely contact me, or, well, anyone on this panel, but you know, me or Alicia, specifically for Iowa organizations that we can pull into this effort at this point. Yeah, and definitely a few specific farmers as well. We'd love to chat with you about that more after the presentation. Absolutely. All right, we have just a few minutes left, about 7 minutes left. Are there other questions, other thoughts, reflections anyone would like to mention before we adjourn for the afternoon? Will this be posted on the IEC site? Alicia.
So yeah, sorry, finding my unmute. Yes, we're recording the session, so we will upload the video to YouTube, so you can review the video and share it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Okay, any other last thoughts before we give you back a few minutes of your Friday? All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your time and attention this afternoon. Oh, one more question. How do we access the title for YouTube? I think the attendees on this will be getting a link, or we'll post it on the website.
Yeah, I'll share our YouTube channel in the chat, so you can, if you don't see it somewhere, then you can just go directly to YouTube.
Great, perfect. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, again, for spending your noon hour with us. And we're really excited about this opportunity, and definitely stay tuned for more information to come.
Thanks, everyone.